started teaching, I had just finished a master's in curriculum and instruction of the teaching of English literature, and I had the dubious distinction of teaching Shakespeare to 17 and 18-year-olds. And this was in Montgomery County Public Schools. I had an honors class, which basically means the kids who didn't want to take AP and the kids who didn't want to be an all-level. But the class was a mix of, probably 10% of them were gifted and talented. They really needed to be in a more rigorous class. 35% of them were science and technology students at a magnet program and just were taking English because they had to. Really the only thing they had in common was that none of them wanted to study Shakespeare. And I remembered my own experience studying Shakespeare in school and was not so keen on it myself. My teachers didn't do a very good job of matching me with the content. And I spoke with a colleague about that, and she said to me, remember, you already know Shakespeare, and it's not your job to show your students how much you know about Shakespeare. It's your job to get your students to care about Shakespeare even a little bit as much as you do. So I designed a totally different unit that was a student-centered unit. I started with a personality quiz that got them thinking about how their personalities would line up with different works of Shakespeare. Then I formed groups based on those personality quizzes and assigned them a text that matched. And these were questions like, I believe loyalty to one's boss is the most important thing in the world. I believe romantic love can be achieved at first sight. Stuff to match them up with themes in Shakespeare. And I wrote up this lesson, and it actually got published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2008, the Kappa Delta Pi Record. And it's called Shakespeare in Circles, basically applying literature circles, which is one style of differentiated instruction, to Shakespeare, which is typically not thought of as something students can do independently. And that really, because that was my first experience, that's been it. I've had to differentiate. I haven't had any other mindset of thinking about teaching from a vantage point of, well, I know this, and so I'm just going to pour it into the minds of the students. No, my job is to help the students come to some section, some intersection where I know it and they know it and we can grow each other. So the focus of this talk this morning, we're going to talk about the background of differentiated instruction, which really relies on a different mindset from a teacher-centered mindset to a student-centered mindset. We're going to talk about two major theorists in the world of differentiation, and then I have a whole bunch of tools that we're going to look at that are used to differentiate. So let's just start with the basic understanding. Most of us like to use the word fair, this is unfair. When I was in DCPS, I taught 7th and 8th graders in the District of Columbia, and I had 50% students with special needs. And I had one student named Jamali who was about this tall, and one student named Amethyst who was about this tall. And Jamali said to me, it's not fair that Amethyst gets extra time. So I said, okay, I'm going to put a Snickers bar up here, and I want you and Amethyst to go get the Snickers bar. And Amethyst goes, that's not fair, he's 6'7", how am I ever going to get the Snickers bar? And I said, Jamali, is it fair if I give her a boost? And he says, oh yeah, that's okay. I said, and that's why she gets extended time on the test. I said, because you're endowed with certain natural gifts that she is not endowed with, and fair does not mean equal. In this scenario, the only person who's going to pass this test is the monkey. We've created just a completely unfair environment. Because our reality is that at the end of the semester, we have students who want to achieve certain goals. Some of our students won't achieve those goals. Others of them will get there in the straight path. Some of them will take a year off. Others of them will get a little step. Some of them will go past our goals and come back to them. We don't know how our students are going to achieve what we set out as objectives or what our department sets out as objectives. We just know that they're going to get there in a different way. And we have to be open to that difference. We have to recognize that students progress at different speeds. Students absorb content in different ways. Students are able to demonstrate their knowledge differently than we are. Most of us probably teach in a way that is very comfortable for us to learn in. I am an auditory learner. I like to hear things, so I like to speak. That's my natural method of teaching. That's how I like to teach. I'm not necessarily a visual person, so PowerPoints I really need help with, because that's not how I learn, that's not how I absorb information. And so if I have a student who's really good at PowerPoint, I prefer for them to write the PowerPoints for me, and I'll just revise the grammar, as opposed to my developing the PowerPoints, because I'm auditory. I like to hear things. But I remember one of my colleagues said to me, because I never used to write on the board, I never used to use a board for anything, and she says, Matt, the board's not for you. The board's for the students. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. The teacher-centered model basically says it doesn't matter how the students learn. It doesn't matter what their preferences are. It doesn't matter what they enjoy. It's as if you could envision, I almost wanted to draw the picture, but the board is so tiny I couldn't do it justice, of just a body with a funnel at the head and you're just throwing information at it. Right? It doesn't matter how they learn. They're all the same. And we're just going to teach the way we want to teach. So there's a guy by the name of Rick Wormelli. He's actually a motivational speaker, former elementary school teacher, and he says that we need to stop hiding behind what's called the factory model of education. Sir Ken Robinson talked about this in a very famous TED Talk, where the school is very much like a factory. In fact, when the common school first came about in the early 1800s, it was based on a factory. Let's have a lot of women on the front lines, and let's have a man as the superintendent who's going to supervise the work of all these women on the front lines, and we're going to promote kids because they're the same age. This was the biggest change from the one-room schoolhouse. We're just going to promote kids by age. So you're 7, you're moving into grade number 2. Doesn't matter that you've mastered the skills, we're just going to promote you socially. And we need to stop hiding behind that because it's not helpful. It's just not a helpful system. Students who've arrived at our doorstep at MC, I've got some kids in my developmental English class who are 19 right out of MCPS. Got some students who are 42. They've been working for several years and they realize they have to come back to school. I had one student in my English 101 class who was 60. And he says, I just need this class. I need this class to learn how to communicate more effectively. I'm not doing it well right now. And recognizing that we have to come to students where they are makes a big difference. So this is a guy by the name of Robert Sternberg. He was formerly a psychologist and a professor of psychology at Yale University. He did his major work in learning theories around the same time as Howard Gardner, who's probably a more popular name. Howard Gardner's got his 8+1 learning styles, came out of Harvard. Sternberg was at Yale. Sternberg is now the president of the University of Wyoming. He actually sent me an email. I asked him if I could use his likeness. He said, yes, use my likeness, and I haven't thought about this theory in 20 years. He said, unlike 8+1, which was what his colleague at Harvard argued, he says there are really 3 kinds of minds. We've got the analytical mind that really likes to break things down, ask lots of questions, figure out all the moving pieces. We've got the practical mind that thinks only about what's in it for me. How am I going to use this for a job? How am I going to use this to build a house? How am I going to use this to make money? And then we've got our creative minds. It's just like, wow, what are the potentials? How can I explode this concept and just reach the stars? And our school system really likes this guy. We really like the person who asks questions, tries to delve down into the center. Some of our programs at MC do an excellent job engaging the practical mind. I've only met 2 students who fall into this mindset, and I've pushed them towards the creative writing track. Like, even if you're not studying English, just take a creative writing class, please, for your own sake. Take a class in poetry, take a class in writing fiction. Because it's going to make a huge difference for you, because you'll actually be in a classroom that's about creating. But we have to recognize that most of our courses are probably written for these people, which means that we're leaving out 2/3 of our potential student population without thinking about it. The other big wig in differentiation is a woman named Carol Tomlinson out at the University of Virginia. She was actually a practicing Catholic nun before she went into the classroom, and then she started teaching in Virginia public schools, went to the University of Virginia to start her doctorate, finished all the coursework, and then went back into the classroom and tried the stuff out for 20 years before coming back and writing her dissertation. And she leads every summer a session, every summer and fall, a session called the Institutes on Academic Diversity. And she's really big in K-12. I think she has a lot to say for post-college because the way she teaches her classes are very different. Having watched her teach, you're just like, in awe. It's like when you hear someone play Verdi for the first time and you're just like, wow, that can be played. She just really understands how to pull the strings of a classroom. And she says that differentiation is basically shaking things up. It's letting students know that they have multiple options to both digest and respond to the information you're giving them. Right? Maybe they're going to read it in a book, maybe they're going to see it on a PowerPoint, maybe they're going to hear it from a student presentation, maybe they're going to watch a YouTube clip, maybe they're going to watch a documentary film, maybe they're going to listen to an audiobook. They have different methods that they can absorb the information, and they'll have different ways that they can share with you that they know it. But the goal for Tomlinson is the end. I need to know, she says, that my students have mastered the objectives of the class. This isn't some, let's have a fun time doing group projects, let's sing Kumbaya around a bonfire. This is, you need to demonstrate that you've mastered this concept. It's very rigorous. She started it for gifted and talented children, and it's been taken, the mantle has been carried by special education teachers. But it started for kids who would finish the classroom content in 5 minutes, and then you have 3 additional hours of instruction, and you're like, okay, well now what? And that's really where she took it from. And she comes from a learner-centered model, which is not that all students are the same and will absorb information in the same way, or even that I need to push the information into the students' minds. Anne showed a really funny picture, I wish I had it, of a man trying to push an elephant into a barn.
I'll send it to you.
Please, that would be really helpful. Right? But the idea that if we're trying to force information into the minds of students, we're going to fail. Right? That famous line, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But if you can find a way to bring the students to your content by engaging them with interests, with levels of questioning that they're not familiar with, if you can figure out how to get them to realize the relevance of what they're doing, like Matt Decker talked about this morning, where if you submit a cover letter with a noun-verb disagreement, chances are you won't get the interview. Maybe someone won't know, but more likely someone will. And you bring that practicality to them and you're like, well, let me help you. Right? I'm here to help you grow skill in this area. So there are some important definitions before we move into looking at content. The first, and the way that I like to define this, I have 2 sons. One child has a learning disability, the other child does not. And I recognize that in speaking to them, I have to speak differently. And when my oldest son says, it's not fair that you talk to Hirsch in this way, I'm like, well, Hirsch doesn't need me to talk to him in the way I talk to you. You know, fair does not mean the same treatment. Fair means giving each person what he or she needs to reach the level of success. And I even like to add that it's the level of success that that person has defined for him or herself. There are some students I have in my English classes who just want to see. They're really okay. They just want to see. They just want to move on. And that's how you define success, then I'll help you get there. I'd much rather you have an A, but if all you're doing is wanting a C, I'm going to help you get there. Which is really, for some of us, we're sitting there going, no, we can't. But the student has to define success. We can't say, you need to reach this benchmark. It's like telling Amethyst that, okay, you're going to get the Snickers bar up here. That's just not possible for her. And also differentiation. It's not creating a different lesson for each student. It's not saying, you know, I know that you really like to learn in pictures, so I'm going to have an entire class where it's only pictures. No, it's recognizing that this student likes pictures, and so maybe you'll have a resource that he can download from Blackboard, or maybe you'll send an email to the students, you might find this slideshow helpful. I'm going to teach my class the same way, but I'm going to provide you a tool that will help you access it. Or like, I keep going back to Matt's beautiful PowerPoints, right? This idea that I've created a beautiful PowerPoint, but if you're a kinesthetic learner who needs to be out of his seat moving around, sitting and watching a PowerPoint is going to help you about this much. Right? So it is really figuring out what can I create from the back end that's going to enable the students to be successful. And there's also a concept here, mindset. This is from Caroline Tomlinson's latest book. Mindset, when she talks about mindset, she's talking about a theorist called Carol Dweck, who was out at Berkeley and is now out at Columbia. She's a social psychologist. And she came up with the idea, or she didn't come up with it, but she coined the term malleable intelligence. She says the brain is a muscle, and the more you use it, the more able it becomes, kind of like your voice. Right? The more you practice singing, the more notes you can hit, because you've trained the muscle in your throat to hit those notes. She says there are two mindsets students can hold about themselves. They can either believe that they are fixed intelligence, so they're never going to get any smarter, they're going to know what they know, or they have malleable intelligence. The more they work, the more they practice, the more they can learn. The difference between a fixed mindset and a malleable mindset, you see this in elementary school. This is when the teacher says, this is going to be a really challenging assignment. The kid goes, not me. It's a fixed mindset. Because what that means is I'm going to be challenged, I might fail, and I'm going to think I'm stupid. Versus the malleable mindset who thinks, challenging, okay, let me try. I might have a hard time with it, but at least I'll learn something. Courses, they won't go into honors level classes because they need the A, as opposed to needing the learning experience. And it's really the way she argues, the way that you talk to children, the way that you praise them when they're growing up. Right, as opposed to, I'm so proud of you for getting an A, you must be really smart. Versus the, I'm so proud of you for getting an A, you must have studied really hard. And I work, when I'm not at the college, I work for a nonprofit organization that works with adults with autism. And we're entirely based on behavioralism. And it's all about that targeted praise. You did a really nice job waiting your turn in line. And it focuses right on the behavior, and that's how you reinforce. It's supposed to be like, good job, high five. Good job for what? What did I do right? How are you reinforcing my behavior? And it's really shifting the way, because when I was in grad school and I studied about B.F. Skinner, I was like, so you want me to treat my students like animals? Like, here's a cookie, you did a nice job. And it's so much richer than that. It's so much more about targeting the praise and reinforcing them for the behavior that you want them to re-exhibit. So you want students to believe that the harder they try, the better they'll do. And trying hard for a lot of students just means, oh, I was up until 4 a.m. doing what? I was on Facebook. Oh, okay. Or I was up until 4 a.m. reading multiple books about how to solve this problem. Well, you tried really hard, so let's see if that's evident in your essay. Let's see if that's evident in your group project, how hard you tried and how targeted your efforts were. And one of the keys, really, for Tomlinson is that differentiation is not a done to, it's a done with. When you start from a teacher-centered mindset, it's always, I'm going to talk at my students. I'm going to tell them what I know. I am the grand vizier of all knowledge of theoretical physics, and I will sit with them and pour it into them. As opposed to, well, as a teacher, it's really my job to help them understand why theoretical physics even matters. Right? Why a Higgs boson is such an important concept. And if they don't leave the class understanding why the concepts are important, I haven't done my job. And I think that's one of the great benefits of teaching at MC as opposed to an R1 or a major research institution, is this idea that our focus is on teaching. Right? Sure, some of us publish and we present. I love presenting and I love going to conferences, but the idea that all I would be focused on is writing theoretical concepts to be published in peer-reviewed journals and not helping students understand why things matter and how courses come together. I don't know, I feel like I'd be less enriched as a professional if that were the case. So we're going to look at a few concepts together, and I'll explain them to you. These are triarchic prompts. Anyone not have triarchic prompts? Let's pass them back this way. Triarchic prompts are really rooted in Sternberg's model of the 3 minds. And the idea that every essay you create, or every piece of writing you draw from your students, can be suited to their type of learning. They can either have a really analytical style of answering the questions, or they can have a really practical style of answering the questions, or they can have a really creative style of answering the questions. And all 3 of them get towards the goal. One of the models on that page is from a world history class where you start with the Alexandrian Empire, the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great. And so you've got your analytical, your practical, and your creative. The creative prompt there basically says, you're a soldier in Alexander's army. Alexander was famous for fighting alongside his soldiers to boost morale. Write a letter home to your wife about how you felt fighting alongside your prince and what that did for your morale and how that improved your willingness to fight. So the students are learning about Alexander and his management style and writing about it, demonstrating it in a creative way, versus the practical essay that says Alexander was really good at land-based wars. His defeat was really at the seafaring. So take one of his land-faring strategies. Alexander typically liked to use the attack from behind. Figure out how you could use that for a sea-based war. So they're learning about Alexander's management style, they're learning about his war strategy, and they're figuring out a practical way to apply it. So those are the examples, right? You're thinking about how can I get students to think about this concept or this content in a way that excites them. Right? I started doing this, and it's caused a little bit of grief for me when I give my students 3 options for a final exam essay. And it's like, it's a little hard for me to know what you're writing, but the benefit for me, I'm an English teacher, so the content is not secondary to, but about the same level as the product, right? Is their formatting correct? Is their grammar correct? Is their thesis statement clear? In classes where it's really content specific and they really have to demonstrate mastery of content, these essays provide them a really good outlet for showing how they've applied these things and made them practical for themselves. Probably not so useful for a calculus class, but history, women's studies, film, media appreciation, really useful stuff. Switching over to the next type of assignment called rafts. A raft is another writing or speaking assignment. Could actually be really useful in a public speaking class, or like an English language, an EL or an RD or a AELP class, where they have to basically choose across a row. So they choose a role that they want to inhabit, and they choose that role, and then determined for them is the audience, the topic, and the format. So one of my favorites on that page, by the way, I created all of these, so if you're finding that my chemistry bingo board is not up to snuff, well, I'm sorry. I haven't taken chemistry in like 28 years, so I was really working with a half a deck on that one. But so the raft says, you know, you've got your role, and now the rest are determined for you, and you're going to write from this vantage point in this format to this audience on this topic, R-A-F-T. My favorite is the class on philosophy, and you're talking about justice and social order, and your role as a maniacal dictator talking to your audience or the United Nations. Your format is a speech, and your topic is why your country uses capital punishment. And it's an opportunity for the students to think, how would this speaker speak from this vantage point? How would this format affect the way the speaker speaks? Because when we talk publicly to an audience of informed people, we speak differently than, yo, dog, what's cooking? What's pop-a-lockin' this? I don't even know what they sound like this weekend. Right? We just change the tenor of our voice. We change the nature of the words that we use when the format and the audience are clear to us. Moving along to the cubed questions. For this, you actually can make, I know it's really hot in here. I'm wearing a sweater, you're wearing a t-shirt. Cubed questions, you're basically creating a 6-sided die. For those of you who like to play Dungeons and Dragons, you can have a dodecahedron dice, but it's a lot harder to think of all those questions. And the 6 sides basically correspond to Bloom's taxonomy of learning. The basic level is just reciting. You know something, and you're going to retell it to me. And then you move up the level from knowing to comparing and contrasting, to that, or really comparing, to then synthesizing, putting things together.
Yeah. What you say earlier.
So this is 1, it's knowing. It's the dice is not exactly like Bloom's taxonomy, it's just built on that. But the first step is just knowing. So retell me something, or state something, or define something. Then you move into comparing, and then combining, and then evaluating. And so this is a dice very close to my heart. I minored in film in undergrad. So the films of Alfred Hitchcock, and you basically move from define the genre to consider other directors in this genre. Look at the 6, the last side of the dice. Consider other directors in this genre. How true are they to Hitchcock's style? Do you feel like they do justice to the master of suspense? And you're basically giving students this range of questions and hoping that they move themselves more towards their level of comfort. Right? If you've got a really bright student who's articulate and has been able to really grasp course concept and is staying at number 1, well then you're completely within your rights to say you really need to answer questions 4, 5, or 6. You can't stay on number 1. You're doing a disservice to yourself staying at number 1. Right? But again, it goes back to that mindset. If the student thinks the only way for me to be smart is for me to get an A, then he's not going to pick number 6. And so being a shepherd to that mindset that the harder you work, the better you'll get is really important. This young woman here asked me a question about where I felt teachers should be the question that I asked the students at the opening. Right? 50-50. Should they care about their students or should they know their content? I care a lot about English literature and writing. I do. But I recognize from a differentiation standpoint and also from my own experience as a student, the teachers who knew their most and cared if I cared were the teachers who I remembered. And I was in a dual curriculum school from grade K through 12. So I had at minimum 3 teachers and at maximum 9 teachers. So if you extrapolate that over the course of 12 years, I probably had like 180 teachers. I can remember 2 who demonstrated enough care about me that I should care about their content. Those 2 teachers, creative writing, public speaking. And that's what I do. Because of 2 teachers out of 180 who cared. Now, if my math teacher had cared about me, maybe I'd be an accountant like my parents wanted me to be. But it's really, we have that amazing power to demonstrate to students that we care about you caring about what we care about. And that power is really transformative. The last thing you're going to see among this style of papers, and then I'm going to hand out a different set of papers in a different method that's a little less haphazard, are bingo boards. Bingo boards are a really fun way to activate prior knowledge among students. To think about what they already know and how they're going to find information. Check out the Chem bingo board. Right? And you don't have to make it spell the word chem. It can spell the word CH. That's fine. Or HY for hydrogen, the first element. Right? It could be 4 boxes. It doesn't have to be 16. But this is a really good tool to give to students that they work on at their own pace, and there's some prize for completing a row. Right? Whether that prize is in the form of an exemption from a certain assignment, or if that prize is in the form of an extra 10 points on their final exam, or if the prize is a homework pass, or if the prize is, they get to teach a class on a topic that they care about for half an hour, they can be the teacher, whatever the prize is. It doesn't have to be an actual monetary sum. But there's some incentive for them to want to do these side projects that also open a door for you to learn about what they know. It's also really interesting to use something like this for a quiz, where you've got like 16 questions, but they only have to answer 4. And the quiz is basically everything we've studied in the unit, and you're going to pick the row or the column or the diagonal that you're going to answer. And obviously you would want to set it up in such a way that they're not answering the same question 4 times. Right? Like, tell me about ionic and covalent bonding. What's the difference between ionic and covalent bonding? Does something in your life have an ionic or a covalent bond? Can you define ionic bonding? No, you've just given them a really easy way out. But it's a very interesting method because when you incorporate student choice into the classroom, suddenly they feel the sense of empowerment, and I apologize for the heat. I know it's a lot. I'm trying to stay animated, but I'm like holishing in here. Or as Mike Myers used to say, I'm a little clamped. Giving them the choice and empowering them to make some decision. It goes back to what Trina said at the beginning, the students who text in class and how, well, they're paying for it, so if they want to fail and pay for it again, then whatever, it's their wallets, right? But a lot of students that I've worked with, and I've taught developmental, first-year composition, second-year composition, high school, middle school, adults now, when they have some say in what they're doing, it's a bit of a motivation to put away the phone. It's like, I'm not just assigned this, I'm actually choosing to do this. Therefore, I've got a little bit more at stake because I made the choice. And so if I fail, I've messed myself up. I've made it impossible for myself. It's a constant challenge. There are actually some really cool web apps where like you can ask a question and students can text in their answer throughout. Very cool web tools for that. It's also a question of if you even want to fight that battle. I don't know that I want to fight that battle. It's a really challenging one. I'll take questions towards the end. I just, in the last 5 minutes, I'm already there. But no, it's definitely, it's a consistent challenge for us as our students become more and more plugged in. I mean, I know myself, I'm plugged in all the time. I've got my phone in my pocket all day long, and every time it bleeps or buzzes, I need to know what the bleep or buzz was, even if it's just like, you're up a level in Candy Crush. What does that have to do with what I'm doing right now? Well, I had to check, and my phone bleeped and buzzed. There was actually an NPR story about that, where web app designers are actually working in motivation theory. They have psychologists, cognitive psychologists on staff to say, what can we do to continue motivating our customers to keep pressing buttons? And that's how apps are built. So it's actually like creating a dopamine trigger in your brain that you're like, oh, I need to press this button. Ah, that feels nice. It's really addicting and it's terrifying. And I'm sure at the next DSM, when they revise the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychological, that technology addiction will be. And they've got hoarding in the latest one. I'm sure there will be technology addiction. There's also caffeine addiction in the current DSM. So all of you drinking coffee might want to get yourself some. Okay. These are some case studies. There should be one extra. Yes, no? 0 extra? 3 more? Are there 0 extra? Huh. Wow. I'm sorry. Again, everything will be available. Mike Mills has it all on the CTL website. It'll all be accessible, the PowerPoint, all the handouts. I also want to just call attention to how I created this handout. This is also how I create my syllabus. I always have space for students to write notes on the document itself. I happen to really like Microsoft Word, and I like to play with Microsoft Word. I also like the concept of Cornell notes, where you split the note paper in half and have a section on the bottom for summarization. And that's how I design my handouts, so that the students have to be actively engaged in reading the handout. It can't just be, oh, another thing for the circular file. I like to do that because then that way you're handing them a piece of paper, and it can become an assessment, right? At the end of the class, you can say, you know what, turn those back into me. I'd like to see the quality of the notes that you took on that handout. That's the other great thing about assessment in the college classroom. We can have innumerable assessments. They don't all have to be formal pencil and paper tests. Okay. So these are some case studies, some experiences from colleagues, both factual and fictional, that they're encountering in their classrooms and trying to figure out how to approach them from a differentiation instruction model. So take a look, see if there are any that resonate with you personally. And maybe we can talk about them as a whole group. I really wanted to do this as the last piece because it really brings it home. If I'm experiencing this problem in my classroom and it's not cell phones, if I'm experiencing this problem in my classroom, how can I use a DI tool to fix it? Number two. So let's just look at number 2. Number 2 is a developmental math class. right? It's 25 students, non-credit. You keep giving them quizzes, or the teacher continuously gives them quizzes, and they continuously do poorly on the quizzes. And not only is the teacher piling up papers, but the students are actually demonstrating that they're not understanding the concept. And in something like developmental math, it's very much about reminding them that they've learned this already, or they should have learned this already, they should have mastered these skills. Math is one of those things that was never explained to me until graduate school. Like, I never understood why I needed it until graduate school, and I was doing my dissertation, and I had all this qualitative data, and they're like, so where are your numbers? And I'm like, numbers? Right? And I was like, oh, you mean those fractions mean something? And you're trying to figure out, how do you get students to demonstrate that they understand a concept when the quizzes are showing you that they're not understanding the concept? So what suggestions did I put underneath there? There were 3, right? Student-led lessons, triarchic assessments, and tiered assessments. When I took the GRE out of undergrad, it was a computer-based test. And the LSAT was not a computer-based test, which I'm grateful for. But the GRE was a computer-based test, and the way the GRE worked is that if the first question would be like a softball. And if you got it right, the next question was a little bit harder. But if you got it wrong, the next question was even easier. You were at the math section going 2 plus 4, and you're like, oh no, what did I do? How did I get such a low-quality question? Creating a tiered assessment in that way works. In a developmental math class, you may start with a softball question. That's question 1. Question 2 will be a little bit more challenging, and you create a kind of choose-your-own adventure. You say to the student, if you found that question challenging, try question 3A. But if you found that question easy, try question 3B. And they advance themselves down a test, and obviously you would have to figure out, your math people, so you'll figure out how to scale it. But you basically design an assessment where the students are challenging themselves at the appropriate level for their perception. It's a lot more work on the back end, but you're creating a single tool that can really help you see, does this student need to be challenged more, or does this student need additional tutoring? That's an example of a tiered assessment. You also might have, go ahead, question.
How do you assess a slacker?
How do you assess a slacker? Well, kick in the pants.
I mean, if they're adept at choosing what's easy.
If they're adept at choosing what's easy,
and they're bright,
you just kind of hope that karma will get them. That would be my answer. I mean, recognizing that for this generation of students, a college degree is a prerequisite to breathing. Like, they don't get to live in the United States without a college degree. Some of them are just here to get out. Others of them see the value in it. If they're just here to get out, it's just like any of us when we stand online at the MVA. Right? We're not there to make rousing conversation with the teller. We're there to get in, get our documents, and get out. For these students, college is just one of those experiences. How low can I make the hurdle? I don't know, it's a challenge, but you're right. There are some students who will learn how to work the system in that way, that they're only choosing the easy route, but at the same time, the malleable intelligence mindset will tell us that's just that's where they want to be. It's a hard concept. I mean, I used to look at my grade breakdown and use that as a judgment of my teaching. Right? If my students all have A's and B's, am I doing a good job as a teacher? And it's like, well, the grading breakdown is really indicative of the student effort, not my teaching. Right? And if I've designed assessments that are meaningful in measuring student knowledge, and the students have just not chosen to rise to that challenge, at the end of the day, the students are ones who have their transcripts, not me. But again, we struggle with this all the time. We have students who are just there to be there. And then we have students who are not there to be there. Like, they're literally never showing up, but they continue to be on your roster until you drop them. I don't know the answer. We struggle with a very challenging but also very promising population of students. The other option, the student-led lessons in that class. If you have a student who's demonstrated that he or she really gets it, maybe you just need to turn over the microphone to that individual. Maybe your students will just understand it better if their peer teaches them. right? There's that statistic, I don't know the statistic, but a small percentage of stuff you remember is stuff that you read. And a little bit larger percentage is percentage of stuff that is demonstrated to you, but the largest percentage of things that you remember are things that you've demonstrated to others. And there's actually an educational theorist by the name of Lev Vygotsky who talks about this, that when you pair students up, you want to pair a strong student with a weaker student and they'll grow together. The strong student will actually grow in his knowledge by ushering the weaker student up a little bit. And obviously you don't want to have like the top performer and the slacker in the same group, but bringing them within 30% of each other and you'll watch them both. It's called the zone of proximal development. Great term. ZPD. Right? And the last one, the Triarchic assessment, that's actually a challenge for you guys to think about. In a math class, there are ways to create questions that are analytical. There are ways to create questions that are practical, and there are ways to create questions that are creative. And if you can figure out how to design an assessment that the students, and they may slack off and choose the simplest one, the creative one, find a new way to demonstrate the number pi. Right? But you're providing them an opportunity to take some ownership of the content that they're studying. And this whole concept, by the way, of designing assessments at the front is called front loading. So there's actually, it's something I learned from my friends who do construction, that like it's much easier to load the front of a cab first and then work backwards. I found this when I was moving from my apartment, that it's much easier to put stuff in the front, but you want to put the light stuff in the front and the heavy stuff at the back. You load the light stuff first all the way in the front of the cab, and then the heavy stuff at the back. So you actually have the most energy to take the heavy stuff off, and then by the time you get to like that lamp, you're like, okay, good, done. But front loading the class, putting the hard work in at the beginning, designing the assessments at the front end, designing the PowerPoints at the front end. This is probably what Sylvia was talking about when she talks about creating bulletproof activities. That, she goes to her 13-year-old daughter and says what's due at the end of class, and if the 13-year-old daughter can't say, then she hasn't made the assignment easy enough to understand. That's probably all done before the class even starts, week by week. And imagine how exhausting her summers must be. But then when she gets to the classroom, she knows the students can just click on the PowerPoint, understand the information, and go. Right? I always love, my wife is a high school teacher, and they're like, don't you love your summers off? And she's like, summers what? She's like, I don't get paid. I'm working more hours designing curriculum. She's like, this is not a summer off. This is a summer of slave labor. So, the concept of doing the hard work in the beginning and then making the students carry the load, that's really what differentiation is about. Because like my colleague told me when I started teaching Shakespeare, you already know your content. You don't need to prove to anyone that you know your content. What you need to do is help the students care a glimmer about what you're teaching as you do. Any questions, comments? I will go to the last slide, which has my email address on it, so that you may contact me. I'm also the only Ratz, R-A-T-Z, at the college. So if you're in Outlook and you type in R-A-T-Z, I'm not in the directory because my department chair hasn't included me in this year's adjuncts, but if you type it into Outlook, my email will come up. As opposed to RAI, if you type in RAI, there are like 8 of them at the college. Then you have to choose which one you're picking. I do very much appreciate your attention and your participation today. I hope that I've left you with some meaningful snippets. And if you have any questions, we can talk offline. I can shut off the microphone and go from there. Thank you all very much.